No one expected Marty Meierotto to return to that old cabin again. For years, he had stayed away from the small wooden shelter hidden deep in the remote valleys of Alaska. Time had quietly passed, and the wilderness had slowly reclaimed the trail that once led to its door. Saplings had grown where boots once packed the earth flat, and winter storms had darkened the logs of the structure that had once protected him through countless freezing nights. But late in the fall of a recent year, when the cold had already begun tightening its grip on the northern landscape, Marty Meierotto made a decision he hadn't expected to make. He would return to the cabin he had once depended on during the long trapping seasons of his life in the mountains. For decades, Marty Meierotto had been known as a man who truly belonged to the wilderness. Long before cameras ever followed him through the frozen valleys on the television series Mountain Men, he had already built a life that revolved around isolation, endurance, and deep respect for the unforgiving land of Alaska. The wilderness was never just an adventure for him, it was a commitment. Every winter demanded preparation months in advance. Supplies had to be gathered, tools repaired, cabins maintained, and routes planned carefully before snow covered the land and turned every journey into a challenge of survival. Life in the backcountry followed a rhythm that few people outside that world could understand. Most mornings began before sunrise, when the darkness still clung to the valley and the cold seeped through every crack in the cabin walls. The first task was always the same: feed the small iron stove and push back the biting cold before stepping outside. Once the door opened, the world beyond the cabin greeted him with silence so complete it almost felt like standing inside a dream. Snow often stretched across the land like an untouched blanket. Sometimes the only signs of life were fresh animal tracks weaving through the trees, quiet reminders that the forest had been moving through the night while he slept. Days were spent traveling long distances to check trap lines, crossing frozen rivers, and pushing through dense forests where the only sound was the crunch of boots against snow. It was demanding work, but for Marty Meierotto, it was also a life built on independence and freedom. Years passed in that rhythm, season after season, but eventually, even the toughest outdoorsman begins to feel the slow pull of time. The work that once felt routine starts to grow heavier, the cold lingers longer in the bones, and priorities begin to shift. For Marty Meierotto, the change arrived gradually. It wasn't caused by one dramatic moment or sudden accident. Instead, it crept in quietly as the years passed. Family became more important. Time away from home felt longer than it once had. Eventually, he stepped away from the endless cycle of winter trapping seasons and television cameras on Mountain Men. To many viewers, the decision seemed surprising. After all, Marty Meierotto had become one of the most recognizable faces on the show, representing the rugged independence that drew millions of viewers to the wild landscapes of Alaska. But for Marty, the change felt natural. Life moves forward whether a person is ready or not. Stepping away didn't mean abandoning the wilderness completely. The mountains had shaped too much of his life to ever disappear from it. But instead of living in remote cabins for entire seasons, he began choosing shorter journeys. Places that once served as vital survival shelters slowly became quiet reminders of another chapter of his life. One of those places was the small hunting cabin hidden deep in that remote valley. Years earlier, the cabin had been essential. It stood in a perfect location along a long stretch of trapping territory. When storms rolled across the mountains or long travel days pushed him deep into the forest, the cabin offered shelter and warmth. Inside, everything had been built for survival: a simple wooden bunk for sleep, a small iron stove for heat, shelves for food and tools. Nothing decorative, nothing unnecessary. But once Marty Meierotto stopped traveling through that region regularly, the cabin slowly faded from his routine. At first, he considered returning to maintain it. Cabins require attention if they're going to survive harsh northern weather. But as time passed and his life shifted elsewhere, the visits became less frequent, until eventually they stopped altogether. That's why the sight that greeted him years later felt so unsettling. When the cabin finally appeared through the trees during his return trip, something immediately looked wrong. The structure itself still stood strong beneath years of storms, but the door was slightly open. Cabins abandoned in the wilderness don't usually change. They remain exactly the way they were left. Dust gathers, wind rattles the boards, and snow piles up against the walls, but doors don't open themselves. Marty Meierotto stopped several yards away and studied the clearing carefully. The wilderness had trained his eyes to notice the smallest details. That instinct had kept him safe through countless winters in Alaska. Looking down at the thin layer of early winter snow covering the clearing, he saw the first sign that confirmed his suspicion. Footprints. Not animal tracks, human footprints. They crossed the clearing in a straight line toward the cabin door. Marty crouched down to examine them. The impressions were still visible, meaning they hadn't been there long. Someone had walked through this clearing recently. That realization raised an immediate question. Who would come this far into such a remote valley? This wasn't a place where hikers wandered accidentally. Reaching the cabin required traveling miles through rugged terrain that discouraged most people from even trying. The tracks stopped just outside the door. There were no clear footprints leading away. Slowly, Marty Meierotto approached the entrance. The wooden latch he had secured years ago now hung loose. The door itself had clearly been opened and closed more than once. When he pushed it open, the hinges groaned softly, breaking the silence of the clearing. Inside, the cabin looked almost exactly the way he remembered it. The bunk still rested along the wall, the stove stood in its corner, the shelves remained in place, but something about the room was different. Dust should have covered everything after years of abandonment. Instead, the floorboards were disturbed. Scuff marks spread across the center of the room, as if boots had moved back and forth there not long ago. Then Marty Meierotto noticed something else, a faint smell of smoke. He moved toward the stove and opened its small iron door. Inside was a thin layer of gray ash, too thin to have been sitting there for years. Someone had cleaned it out before lighting a fire. Someone had stayed here. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light inside the cabin, he noticed something partially hidden beneath the bunk, a metallic object. Curious and cautious, Marty knelt down and pulled away a scrap of cloth that had been covering it. Beneath the bunk rested a metal container. The scratched surface and reinforced corners suggested it had been carried through difficult conditions. Someone had brought it here intentionally. He pulled the container into the center of the room and examined it carefully. The latch was closed, but not locked. After a moment of hesitation, he opened it. Inside were several items wrapped carefully in cloth. The first bundle contained photographs, dozens of them. Some were faded with time, others looked newer, but what caught Marty's attention immediately was the subject of the photographs. Groups of people standing in rugged outdoor locations across remote landscapes. Their clothing suggested experience in the wilderness. Heavy jackets, practical equipment, travel gear meant for harsh conditions. These didn't look like tourists. As Marty Meierotto studied the images more carefully, he noticed something that made him pause. In one photograph, partially visible behind a group of people, stood a small log structure. The roofline looked unmistakably familiar. It was his cabin. Someone had taken that photograph standing only a short distance from where he now stood. Beneath the photographs in the container was a worn notebook. When he opened it, the pages revealed handwritten notes filled with dates, locations, and short observations about travel routes across the wilderness of Alaska. Many of the places mentioned were extremely remote areas, locations that only experienced backcountry travelers would recognize. Some entries even listed coordinates. Others described cabins hidden deep in the forest. Scattered throughout the notebook were sets of initials written next to certain entries. 2 letters repeated across multiple pages. Whoever wrote the notebook had been documenting movements across the wilderness for a long time. At the bottom of the container was the final item, a folded map. When Marty Meierotto spread it across the cabin floor, he immediately recognized large sections of the Alaskan backcountry. Dark circles had been drawn across different regions of the map. Each circle marked a location, cabins, valleys, remote routes through the mountains. One of those circles sat directly over the valley where he now stood. This cabin had been deliberately marked, and several other circles pointed to places Marty recognized from his years traveling through the wilderness of Alaska.
Whoever created the map understood the land very well. Weeks passed after the discovery, but the mystery refused to leave Marty's mind. Eventually, he returned to the cabin once more during the deep winter months. By then, snow had erased the footprints he had seen earlier. The clearing looked peaceful again, as if nothing unusual had ever happened there. Standing inside the quiet cabin, Marty Meierotto looked around the small room. Without the metal container beneath the bunk, the cabin had returned to what it once was, just a simple shelter standing alone in a vast wilderness. But the knowledge of what had been hidden there changed everything. Somewhere beyond those mountains were the other locations marked on that map, other cabins, other valleys, perhaps other secrets hidden where no one had looked in years. In a place as vast as Alaska, some stories vanish without explanation. The wilderness has a way of keeping secrets, and sometimes the truth about what happened